All right, cool. So thanks everyone for coming. So this is a journal club talking about Meta's paper that they released in October toward a real-time decoding of images from brain activity. So basically they're doing retrieval and reconstruction of images that were observed by people as they were being scanned in an MEG machine. And it's extending a lot from the previous work in the fMRI domain. Specifically, the paper that our group released, MindEye, did this same approach, but using the fMRI modality, and also specifically the brain diffuser paper from Firkin, Ursulik, and Rufin van Rullen is referenced a lot in this paper. So they're borrowing from these other approaches in fMRI and seeing if they can get it to work with MEG. So before I dive into the paper, basically I'm just gonna kind of walk us through it and share my thoughts on it, and hopefully we can discuss certain things. But before that, if anybody has, I'm curious, like, did people like the paper? Did people have any impressions about this? What were people's takeaways from this? Yeah, Teresa?
Yeah, maybe something I'm curious about. So I'm not exactly sure what are all the levels of analysis that the researchers have covered here, but if we examine the broader paradigm of visual recognition research in neuroscience and hierarchical processing and whatnot, it seems that the established paradigm in neuroscience is very fundamental to the subsequent development of convolutional neural networks approaches in AI. And I would be curious to see to what extent the accuracy of this method is like replicable across different levels of the visual processing hierarchy. So for example, if we were to distinguish between the dorsal and ventral pathway, or even more specifically look at regions like the parahippocampal place area or like the entorhinal cortex and whatnot, which is somewhat in alignment with hippocampal research. I would be curious to see to what extent, like, how can we compare the resolution of image recognition they were able to achieve via this method in comparison to, say, traditional dimensionality reduction techniques that have been previously used to study place cells or grid cells and recover the latent spaces of image reconstruction.
Yeah.
Because, for example,
Yeah.
I've interacted with a bunch of neuroscientists who have very differing opinions on fMRI, and there seems to be a growing mistrust against the usage of fMRI and the applications of machine learning to that domain. So it seems like some level of more rigorous and wide-scale cross-validation with the goal of comparing the results would likely enhance the validity and translational potential of such a paradigm.
Yeah, so specifically with MEG, you can't really localize stuff, right? So you're talking about specific areas, right, of maybe fusiform face area or parahippocampal place area. You can specifically target and try to apply your model specifically to those brain regions with fMRI, but with MEG, you can't really do that because the localization isn't there. They have the, you don't get a 3D image of the brain with voxels. You just get the 300 or so channels around the head. So like that's an immediate problem specifically with MEG. Maybe you can like decode things well, but you don't have this resolution of being able to localize stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, for your questions, you would need something with a lot better localization properties. So maybe let me give a brief overview of like the MEG fMRI distinction, right? So with the whole aspect of this paper is saying we can do this with MEG. So that's really important because then we can apply these decoding models to basically real-time application, like millisecond level. And with fMRI, you're only able to get a brain volume every 1 to 2 seconds, but you also have the hemodynamic delay. So you have to wait for the blood to reach the areas of the brain that were, active, and you're recording the blood changes. So you have to wait like 6 seconds for the activity to even be readable due to the delay of the blood. But with MEG, you're literally taking the magnetic fields that are produced by the electric like the electric signaling of the neurons, producing a very weak magnetic field that's detectable by the channels around the brain. So you've got this trade-off, right? And the question, I guess, that they're trying to do is maybe the spatial resolution is really bad, but it's still enough to do reconstruction and retrieval, in which case, if you care about something like brain-computer interfaces and real-time communication, MEG is the only one. It is doable, but not fMRI for like decoding at the sub-second level.
Mhm.
Alex says, I think as the first OPM systems are coming into play, this sort of serves as a first step as to what might become better with MEG. I'm not, what is OPM? OPM is,
Paul, I can do a little. I don't know many of the details of OPM, but it's optically pumped magnets. I believe something along those lines. But the major benefit of it is it doesn't. It's basically like the same MEG technology, but it doesn't need to be super cooled. So you can, instead of having the giant like hair dryer that is kind of like fixed in place and inside a Faraday cage and everything like that, right? You're basically just wearing a helmet with the sensors kind of like slotted into the helmet, and the sensors like fit in the size of those OPM sensors like fit into the size of your hand. So you can theoretically have people like move or talk to each other, or sit face to face and measure their brain activity and things like that. So the point of OPMs is that it will be like MEG level data acquisition, but like with much greater ecological validity or whatever.
oh, good to know. Thanks,
Yeah.
Sam.
Mhm.
But I'm guessing there must be a trade-off then where it's not as good because you don't have the like ultra cooling to have the detectors work as well.
Yeah, the detector technology is different. So I think probably yes, it's not going to be as good right off the bat. That seems like a reasonable assumption. But I think people are investing in it pretty hard. I think we're buying and building space for an OPM system at Princeton.
Oh, I didn't know that, for
Yeah,
instance,
yeah.
was OPM.
Harrison on my office next door office person is heavily involved with that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
That's exciting then.
yeah.
Um, yeah, that's very promising. And getting ECOG-like data quality out of MEG. Hmm. I'll have to look more into that. So yeah, my kind of takeaway from the paper, I guess, is that, yeah, you can do retrieval and reconstruction with MEG. The quality is going to be worse, but it does show that it's at least feasible. And they make this whole deal out of, doing real-time decoding. And in their blog post, they talk about how this AI system can be deployed in real time to reconstruct. And I feel like that's kind of, some people, when I was looking into like people's reactions to this paper, they thought that Meta was able to already do real time. And that's definitely not what they've done. They're basically showing that it can work offline with MEG, and that in theory, you could deploy this later on to real time, right? So I think that's an important distinction. It's not trivial to just have an offline pipeline and then apply it in real time and be able to immediately have like decoding immediately and show it to the participant and all that. There's a lot of steps that are going to be required to deploy it. And this is the same problem with fMRI, where like we have systems that can do real time in the sense of like immediately pre-processing the data and being able to change the experiment to the participant, but it's a whole ordeal getting that whole system set up. So, and also I guess in real time, the way that they're talking about real time is like immediate millisecond level. For reference with fMRI real time, I think people generally just mean it to be you are able to, while the person is still being scanned, pre-process, evaluate their fMRI activity, and then be able to use it to change the experiment or give them feedback, stuff like that. So I think there's a bit of a like vocabulary difference too in what people have been meaning with real time. What I've been trying to do with real time with fMRI is like 12 seconds later, can you decode what the image is that they saw? Yeah, Teresa?
Okay, so this would be a very, once again, off-topic tangential question, but I was thinking about potential idiosyncratic applications of this more general methodology. So one source of inspiration was existing in very minimal research on synesthesia, where basically researchers show how those, I don't want to say patients, just like subjects tend to conflate and aggregate features across modalities into basically one so that their firing is reliably correlated. And similarly, and I think this was on rodent research, I've read a bit of research showing how social networks tend to get mapped onto the same regions of the hippocampus, giving rise to something like superposition of those networks, such that consistently with the social brain hypothesis, a stronger social network that gets encoded there, it should be also predictive of higher navigation capabilities, which I don't think is like ground truth, but it seems to be an interesting direction. And the reason I'm using this as a motivation is that if we look at the development of logic as a branch of mathematics and trace back the history of the paradigm, one thing that comes to my mind is Frege's work, who was like pretty much the person who invented predicate logic. And in his early work, he drew a clear and distinct dichotomy between what he called arithmetic, where he grouped all the parts of mathematics that are not geometry, so not arithmetic in the true sense, but even like analysis and whatnot, number theory, versus geometry. And implicit in his dichotomy was that logicism should be able to, everything in arithmetic should be reducible to pure logic, but not the same applies to geometry, because he was operating with the assumption that geometry is something that's inherently comprehensible via the means of, I guess, mental intuition, unlike other parts of mathematics, right? And formal math is not super relevant to neuroimaging as such, but I've been thinking of, so given that we do know that every once in a blue moon, people in cognitive neuroscience try to study how complex reasoning takes place and engages multiple sensory modalities and whatnot, it then maybe stands to reason that there could exist interesting usages of graph neural network learning that could somehow try to once again recover how different images and visualizations of complicated geometric objects could be mapped onto the, I guess, like conceptual network structure underlying the subsequent emergence of the intuition. I don't really know if this is something that would be studyable as such, let alone with this methodology, but it seems like a topic that, if understood with the current technology available, could lead to pretty impactful translational impacts on both educational systems as well as the general development of AI. So I was wondering what your thoughts on decoding images from brain activity in more idiosyncratic use cases, be it pretty idiosyncratic subjects or very niche and specific tasks, could be like.
Yeah, that's I guess. So I don't really know that much about graph neural network stuff. I mean, so you're asking about individual, like, idiosyncratic tasks for decoding?
No, more like being able to recover the visual representations of images as such, and somehow, perhaps like in parallel over the very same task, somehow recover the non-visual representation of something that was being processed during the same time interval, to see whether there exists a way to learn some sort of isomorphic mapping from one to the other, or some sort of approximation that would better illustrate how it is that multimodal communication takes place and enables greater grasp of what it is that is being processed. Because even with the usage of the word intuition, it seems like it's very, very fuzzily defined in the status quo, and no one really knows what they mean by it. And given that increasingly more research at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and AI aims to deal with the parallels and analogies between human reasoning and artificial neural networks, it seems that until we reach some sort of more nuanced and mathematically quantitatively precise understanding of what's the anthropomorphic assumption from which we are basing those analogies to begin with, it's going to be very hard to draw analogies that are truthfully reliable.
I feel like this is a very deep question. I don't know the answer to this.
All good, all good.
I mean, yeah,
there-
you can.
There's work out there trying to decode, we're not in as sophisticated, not using even neural networks necessarily, but trying to decode like mental images and things that are like endogenously generated. Like there's a, they're trying to decode like the content of dreams and things like that, right? But that work's still pretty, I can put some links in the chat.
Yeah,
Great,
so I guess my understanding is, you can do this decoding stuff, and there's been some papers that have been more specifically looking into what is going on, like trying to understand the function of the brain from that, if that's related to what you were asking about. So like, on the one hand, there's what Sam was talking about, where you can just directly try and generalize these models to, say, visual imagery, or to like potentially sleep, I guess, but I don't think anyone's tried that. But also you can, like, once the model's trained, you can probe it in certain ways to look at like functional specialization of what different parts of the brain are doing. So maybe that can kind of get at what you're talking about.
Yeah, sounds about right. Like, I don't really think this has been studied and that we have the technology to study this like very precisely at this very moment. Is more of a broad, long-term, more of a philosophical than scientific interest, and this seemed somewhat reminiscent and tangentially related. So I was just like curious what your thoughts would be.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have a great answer for that. If anyone does, definitely chime in or put in the chat. So I'm just going to go through the paper, I think, and people interrupt whenever you have thoughts or comments for discussion. So the paper begins by highlighting this distinction that we already talked about. MEG has better temporal resolution. And then their idea is, can we get it to work with MEG, reconstructing and retrieving images using 3 modules, right? So pre-trained embeddings, so they don't have to do anything for this. They're using pre-trained embeddings from some other model that's already existing. The second one is their MEG module. So this is the actual thing that they train to go from the MEG signals to eventually the output, which would be the embeddings for retrieval, or the embeddings that get input into the pre-trained image generator model. And in their case, they're using the same image generator approach and model as the brain diffuser paper from Ursulik and Van Rollen, which we can get into more details when we get there. And their main results are that when they compare to their own linear decoders that they train, they find that their more complicated MEG decoder approach does better on retrieval. They show that Dino V2, which is Meta's model, so I think that's why they're highlighting it. They show that Dino V2 does the best in doing, they kind of worded it weirdly here. They say late brain responses to images are best decoded with Dino V2, but they're not decoding the brain responses, right? They're still decoding the images. And I'm not sure also why they specifically talk about late, because I think by that, they're just talking about the fact that it's like category level of signal that's being used for the retrieval. So basically, my understanding is they're just saying that Dino V2 worked the best for retrieval. But even that has a bit of nuance because they have two test sets that they talk about in the paper. They have a small test set and a large test set. And Dino V2 only outperformed the rest in one of those two. And the other one, VTG19, did the best. So I think they're highlighting Dino V2 maybe partly because it's Meta's model, but also because it did the best in one of the two test sets. And then with the third contribution they outline in the abstract, they suggest that MEG primarily has high-level features compared to the fMRI results. And I think basically what they're saying here is that they were able to do like category level decoding, and they show that their reconstructions maintain the category semantics, but they lack the low-level detail. Whereas with the fMRI approach, you can get some of the low-level detail out. And so they're saying because MEG reconstructions don't look good for low level, that MEG signals lack low level content. So the main approach here, and again, interrupt me whenever, is
So one question.
Yeah.
So I'm not exactly sure if I understand this particular aspect, but what I'm thinking about is an analogical problem in mechanistic interpretability, which is the subfield of AI research that aims to reverse engineer neural networks. So around 2 months ago, Anthropic wrote this paper where they were trying to shift the paradigm, given that previously it was quite well established that it is superposition, meaning a neuron representing multiple features at a time, which is the necessary consequence of the pigeonhole principle, through which polysemanticity, meaning a neuron representing multiple features at a time, arises. And in their research, they try to show that even in the absence of superposition, which they try to impose by a sparsity penalty via the objective function, even in the absence of superposition, polysemantic representations remain a priority. And in this research, they were using a different machine learning model, namely autoencoder, aka dictionary learning, which is like this idea coming from compressed sensing research, where they try to recover the original higher dimensional representations that those models, pre-trained LLM models, intrinsically develop. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that in that research, they were claiming that basically using the dictionary learning method, the dictionary learning was able to recover more high dimensional features that the model itself intrinsically develop, while controlling for the possibility that it's merely learning the inherent high dimensional structure of the data that the LLM model itself failed to capture. Because it seems to exist the possibility that if you somehow are able to recover the original features, be they chunks of text or images, it stands to reason that perhaps the original model itself failed to recognize those, yet some other more robust model can learn it. So it's almost somewhat analogous to, say, scanning a child's brain when it's engaging in math, and then you take a mathematician and tell them to basically try to understand based on the fMRI what the concept underlying that representation was. And there exists a non-zero possibility that they in fact understand it better than what got encoded in the brain. So perhaps using this imprecise analogy, I was wondering, what is the method or mechanism for controlling that those are indeed intrinsic to what we are extracting from the fMRI signal, as opposed to just being able to learn the images themselves that are largely extrinsic to the internal representations. It might be that I just fundamentally misunderstand something about this methodology, but yeah, I would really appreciate a clarification.
Yeah, let me know if I'm misunderstanding what you're saying. So essentially, the one aspect is that like just because you can't decode something doesn't mean that the information isn't there necessarily.
Yeah,
And
so almost like a false positive, I guess. Yeah.
yeah. And then also this idea of like encoding multiple different things in the same region is kind of what you were talking about, like, right? Like
Yeah,
there's
so
been some stuff outside of neuroscience. Like I remember Anthropic's paper dissecting neural networks, trying to identify like specific concepts or like trying to disentangle polysemantic concepts from a network. But we do know that it's possible for neurons to encode very specific concepts, like the Jennifer Aniston cell or something, right? Like you can get very specific concepts and that seem to not be disentangled like that. I'm not that familiar on this literature,
okay,
but
so maybe like the 101 like intuition from linear algebra on disentanglement is that like generally speaking, it shouldn't be possible to recover a higher dimensional representation because it's like inverting a rectangular matrix unless sparsity is enforced so that you're always looking at just like one feature at a time. And in such a setup, you can find approximate solutions to this NP-hard problem. And this precise and dictionary learning, which I mentioned earlier, was one of the approaches that is able to do that because the map first projects to a higher dimensional space, then projects back, compares the error, and then you like keep doing so until you feel like you have recovered a truthful higher dimensional representation that got compressed into a lower dimensional latent space. So I'm assuming this principle holds even in neuroimaging, but again, I haven't worked directly with neuroimaging thus far, so I'm trying to understand how this analogous problem is typically handled in such setups.
I'm not sure. Anyone else want to chime in on this? I also feel like I'm not totally understanding the question.
This may be also out of my area of expertise, but I have a different point I want to look at, which is that we mentioned that the MEG has worse spatial resolution, and we also see that we don't get those low-level features extracted. And I'm curious what the spatial resolution of MEG actually is, because my understanding of it was that it was somewhere in between EEG and fMRI in its spatial resolution. Is that a correct assumption? I'm not sure if I'm interpreting it correctly.
Yeah, I think that's correct. The spatial resolution is much better than EEG, but it's kind of so I feel like there's this distinction of spatial resolution versus localization, right? So like, can you detect a difference that is like from signals originating at like different if the car there's a difference in whether you can detect there's a difference between the resolution of like subtle changes in the neural activity versus like being able to localize. Like with fMRI, I can say something like 3mm voxels, and then you know that like the resolution is that you have 3mm cubes and you have bold for each of those cubes. But with MEG and EEG, you basically just have the channels, and then you have to kind of infer
Yeah, because
like
it's more of
where it's
like
coming from.
more of a local field of activity than specific local activations. I see what you're saying, but the I suspect this dynamic is why we get a lot less spatial resolution for low level features out of this, because to get low level features, you pretty much need the fine grained localization in early visual cortex, because that's where that structure is. And if you don't have the spatial resolution or the localization capacity for that type of precision, then you're not really going to get much structure out of that. Because even if you have channels for early visual cortex to pick up the signal, you're not going to know where that structure corresponds to in the image if you can't localize it. So I think that is just a limitation of MEG currently.
I think that is a good question, though, that I'm not really that certain about, because even if you can't localize something, people talk about MEG as having what, like several millimeter resolution or something, like near fMRI resolution. So like if the signal is there, even if you don't have any anatomical reference point and you
Well,
don't
all
know
you
where
really
it's
need
coming
is
from.
you need relational signal. So if your channels are sensitive to a couple of millimeters of range, and you know that that channel is to the left of that one, and you have like a grid of channels, then presumably you should be able to get some structure out of that. But because yeah, you don't need anatomical precision to get the structural detail. You just need a relational space of data. But even if the relational space is there, you still, I think, are losing some precision compared to fMRI. But I think that MEG has a lot of other advantages, clearly, and so perhaps as the technology continues to improve, the spatial resolution will as well, and we can get some more of that signal out.
Yeah.
I think you have to work a lot harder with MEG to kind of like say something about that resolution. Like I think right, because you have to triangulate where these signals are coming from based on scalp level, sensors, right? Which is not the case with fMRI, right?
Well, that's
So
my point, is you to get structure to reconstruct an image, like you wouldn't need precision localization to the brain. You just need precision within your relational data, right? I need to know where this channel is corresponding to all of the other channels in space.
yeah,
And whether or not that's mapped to the brain precisely is sort of irrelevant for the decoding task. But
absolutely agree. I also think there's like there might be like correlative information between brain variables on larger scales, even for like relatively lower level features potentially on larger spatial scales that vary in terms of their timing, right? That you could pick up with something like MEG, right? Like there's a sense of like, okay, when you're thinking of like images or something like that, right? That there's just like information represented in certain parts of the brain kind of like statically, and other information represented in other parts of the brain, right? But if the algorithm can pick up on kind of whatever like differences in oscillatory, dynamics on larger spatial scales, then you could sort of kind of get at things that seem fine-grained through like larger scale interactions, right? I don't know if this algorithm is really sensitive to that kind of thing, but I wouldn't commit to the idea that you just simply can't get at this kind of information based on spatial resolution alone, right? Because we know that there's all sorts of recurrent stuff happening, right? And like maybe a fine-grained difference is still encoded differently at a larger spatial scale between two different brain variables, right? That you might be able to detect if you're sensitive to timing and things like that with MEG.
yeah, that's an interesting concept. And I think especially as you get into higher level brain regions that have larger receptive fields, that recurrent effect becomes more pronounced, and that the hierarchy of visual processing sort of, maybe you could trace it back to its finer grained roots depending on how it propagates.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also Alex brings up another point in the chat saying that it's an actually different source of information you're getting with MEG, right? You're getting like the magnetic field is perpendicular to the electrical signaling. So you're actually getting the like inner sulcus, I believe, of the cortex. You're not getting like the outermost. So you're getting like a different source of the brain activity as well, which is like, yeah, which would be different from like EEG or fMRI, I guess. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna keep going through the paper. So essentially, I'm not gonna go into all the detail right now of like exactly how they do the reconstruction because they're borrowing it from Ursula and Van Rollen. The idea is very actually pretty simple, and it's the same as a lot of these fMRI papers where you take the brain signal and you use some model. Either that could be rich regression or like a convolutional approach is what they do here, or in our group's case, we do an MLP. But basically, you get the brain signal through a model that gets to the dimensionality of some sort of model space, like clip laden, right? And you can do clip loss to align the two representations. So you take the embeddings from, say, a clip model or dyno model or VTT, whatever. These are just frozen and pre-trained models, and you're aligning this, in this case, MEG model, to have outputs that are aligned to the embeddings of the clip space or whatever space it is. So like you're doing contrastive learning, in other words, you're trying to maximize the cosine similarity for the paired samples and minimize the cosine similarity of all of the unpaired samples in the batch. And they're just doing the exact same loss that was used to train the original clip models from the Radford et al. Paper. And something interesting here that I noticed is, so they talk about these two objectives, right? So for retrieval, you're doing clip. And so you're caring about the L2 normed outputs, in other words, so that you can do this cosine similarity matching and find the nearest neighbor, and that can be your retrieval target. For reconstruction, you need to do, you can't just operate on the L2 normed outputs. You need to match the direction and the magnitude. You need to get like, you basically have to get the exact same numbers that are the inputs into your generative model, if that makes sense. So you basically you have to do MSE loss or some other loss that's not done on the like L2 normed space. So they have a specific loss function for the reconstruction objective. And then they say that they combine the two. So they have a hyperparameter lambda that is telling you like how much do you weight the two losses. And from our MindEye paper, we talk about there being a trade-off between doing reconstruction and doing retrieval. So we had to have this separate submodule that extends from the backbone in order to negate, like to overcome this trade-off. Like we were seeing if you don't have this green box, if you don't have an MLP projector, in other words, if you're just doing a loss for the for a shared embedding that's used for retrieval or fed into a diffusion prior to do reconstruction, then as retrieval gets better, reconstruction gets worse and vice versa. We see a trade-off. And so you can't just like directly merge the losses together is what we observed. And so I was wondering how they surmount this for doing this combined loss. And I believe that actually what they're doing is that they're training the model separately. Lambda is set to 1 or 0, depending on whether they are doing the retrieval or reconstruction. So they have a footnote saying that they set lambda to 1 for only doing the retrieval part. So I believe actually that they train the model separately. So once for retrieval, once for reconstruction. And so it's a little bit misleading. They don't actually combine it in this way. It's either that they're either doing just the pure clip loss or just the pure MSE loss, I believe. So, but yeah, the MSE is for reconstruction so that they can just directly pipe the output through versatile diffusion, which is a generative model that outputs images given a clip image embedding. Any questions so far on that?
Do you believe so? I'm not exactly sure, but do you think that putting some more like probabilistic components into the overall pipeline could potentially enhance the accuracy. So in other settings, I've heard of CTC badge being combined with minimum base risk and whatnot. And I was wondering if in cases where you are not really that certain, introducing some amount of probabilistic computation could potentially help the model, or whether it's not really applicable for MEG.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it could be worth a shot adding that in. And also, I think like the fact that they totally separate the two is not helpful. Like we found in the MindEye paper that having the two submodules actually improves the reconstruction because of having this separate retrieval objective. So then in theory, like what you're saying is try and introduce some probabilistic sampling or like use other sources. Don't just have one objective for one pipeline. If you try and like merge other objectives into the same overall end-to-end model, that could actually, I believe, improve things. So I think it makes sense, yeah. Yeah, so this brain module, they talk about all the steps here. They're actually adopting the exact same approach as their previous paper from 2022, which was doing decoding of speech perception. So there's a separate paper that they previously released, or at least John Remy King's group released. And they have this architecture here for how they approach it, and they adopt a very similar approach for this paper. So essentially, and I think there's also a better table I can show in the appendix for this. Yeah, here. So 272 is the number of MEG channels, I believe, and 181 is the number of time points. So they downsample the MEG, and they are using, I think it's negative, it's like half a second in the past to 1 second into the future for a stimulus onset. So like every image was shown, what was it? It was, they're using the things MEG dataset, which was a 400 millisecond display of an image followed by 1 second blank. So it's 1.5 seconds per stimulus per image that they show. And so they take this time window of, I guess, half a second before the onset to a second after the onset. And that is reflected in the input shape. It's something like that. And they do this spatial attention block, which is that they get a, they don't discuss what that is in the actual, in the reconstruction paper, but they talk about it in their older paper. They map their MEG channels to 3D sensor locations and project it onto a 2D plane. So they basically have XY coordinates per channel. And then they parameterize that in Fourier space. And essentially they're weighting the inputs of every channel by this learned function that's dependent on the spatial position of the channels. And then there's a linear projector. And then there's this interesting subject-specific linear layer that I think is actually really cool. So unlike basically all of the fMRI reconstruction papers that were trained independently per subject, this is a single model that is trained across all of the subjects in their things data set, which is like 4 subjects. And so it's a single model that has subject-specific linear layers right here. That so they are doing this kind of cross-subject model, which I think is really interesting. And they don't really compare it to what would happen if you have independent models per person. But I think this is a really nice approach towards getting to potentially generalizable models, like training across many subjects, and then potentially having a new person. If you care about real time, you'll have a new person's brain you need to rapidly map to. So if you have all this other stuff of the model already laid out for you, then it should be easier to translate to a new person's brain. And they don't really highlight that, interestingly. I thought that like that's a really novel application, especially if you care about real time. Is there another question?
Yeah, actually, I have one question about it. So, if you said that the subject-specific linear layer that they do achieve the domain adaptations, so I just wanted to know how they achieve it, because you have said we have seen a lot of papers that they do have a lot of work, but all focused on the subject-specific space, and you have shown me about the memory mechanism paper, and the guy, perhaps you still have some memories about it. Names it's
From
names
Hughes,
Huge,
right?
yeah, it's Hughes. He used unshared networks which can just pick up different subject and set them into MLP. And after that, they will reshape it into this normalized shape. And after that, they send it into this attention block or the shared weight network. So I just want to know if they have the same methodologies with it.
Yeah, it's not the exact same application, I think, but yeah, the Hughes paper, the Algonaut winning paper, yeah, he also does a similar thing where it's a single model, but there are these subject-specific linear layers that you give it the subject index, and then it does this specific mapping that it has to learn per participant just for that aspect of the model. So yeah, similar thing with the Hughes paper and for this paper. And interestingly, I don't really see it get mentioned that much because there's a whole field, like Sam's familiar with hyperalignment stuff, right? Where and shared response modeling, you have to have people generally see the same things in order to map them to the same functional space. But having a trainable linear layer like this, you don't really need it to be that subjects all see the same stimuli in the same order. You can just have the model learn to represent subject-specific mappings in the context of a larger, nonlinear, many parameter model.
Does that make sense? But if that's so, so every time if you accept or just input another subject, you will have to retrain for another MLP layer. So it might not that kind of domain adaptation.
You could. I mean, it depends. You could only train the linear layer, right? You could, in theory, just like freeze everything else or fine tune
Yeah.
everything else.
Yeah, makes sense.
So you only have to learn from scratch a simple linear mapping for a new person.
Yes.
Yeah, so it makes it actually feasible for these heavily, these large nonlinear models to be more quickly applied to new people. Teresa, did you have a comment?
Yeah, but this is not super related to this previous question, but I was wondering, so something that I noticed in some speech recognition work is that instead of using spectrograms, people opt for purely representing the time domain of a given recording with the assumption / reasoning being that this is going to give us higher accuracy. And in many such setups, the objects that the structures that you're working with are tensors that contain information about like the time, then say the phoneme set and some other variables presumably. And the interesting thing that happens in neural decoding of speech is that sometimes people integrate their neural recordings with existing transformer models for predicting the next phoneme, analogously to very traditional LM pipelines. But the problem becomes that given that most pre-existing transformer models inherently require one-dimensional time series, a problem arises where you necessarily need to do some amount of lossy compression from your multivariate data so as to make it compatible with the with the transformer model. And from my understanding, one intermediate step that's quite accurate, but I'm not sure how exactly integrates with the subsequent steps of the pipeline is using like group convolutions or even simple perceptrons and whatnot. And I was wondering how one should a priori go about evaluating the trade-off as to what's the first step of like what domain I want to represent such neural data in, as well as how does one go about creating those bridge modules when there exist pre-existing transform models that are likely more robust and more accurate than whatever one single team could create for the specifics of their unique task, if there is not a perfect compatibility between the data versus the model that could be leveraged at the later stages of the processing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess getting into a more general question is like, how do you accurately map to like how do you best use the time domain? How do you best apply data from different modalities to the transformer architecture when it's not immediately obvious the best way to map it to? Is that kind of?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an open question, I think. Like what's the best way to do it? Like with you could just like patchify the brain, for instance, where that becomes the sequence layer length, but then you don't have like the temporal aspect to it as well. We've been kind of talking about different approaches that you might be able to do. You could like separately try to map your transformer to different time points. So like for instance here, they have the 181, right? They have 181 time points, but they do temporal aggregation, which is just a linear mapping from 181 to 1. So it's super simple. Maybe there's a better way to integrate information across time points, right? Like it seems, you know, there are various ways to go about it. And here all they do is linearly map it into a reduced dimensionality and then do an MLP. So, I mean, I think that's an open question. Best way to go about it.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Yeah, and thanks for the questions as well. So that is their overall pipeline, right? Which is inspired by their convolutional approach of using the subject layers. I lost my figure here of doing this, right? And so what they're left with then is the output dimensionality matching the embedding of what they want, VGG, clip, whatever. And for retrieval metrics, I'm just going to skip to the figures here. They evaluate across all these different embeddings to see what they can do the best retrieval in. For their case, retrieval is, they have these two test sets that are defined by the things data set. So the things data set initially, what happens is they have 4 subjects. They all see 22,000 unique images, and every image is only shown once, aside from a smaller test set from which those images are shown 12 times. So they're repeated 12 times. And so the images span over 1,000 categories and things. So these categories are things like outlet, cat, seatbelt, piggy bank. So you have these different kind of exemplar level categories. And for the small test set, this is composed of those images that were repeated 12 times, and then you average across the repeats for when they had observed it. And they also intentionally take out images in the training set that were of the same category as those in the test set to make it a bit harder on themselves, I guess. In addition, those images that they took out of the training set that shared the categories of the test set, they used that to define the large test set. So that's how they have this separate test set. So the large test set is harder because it contains multiple examples of the categories that were in the small test set. So the small test set is composed of unique category images. So retrieval is basically trying to find the right category. The large test set is you'll have multiple examples of the same category within this bigger bank of images. And so that's why the performance is worse, because you're having to more finely retrieve the details of what the original image was, maybe not just the category level. So that makes it harder. And the chance performance is respectively different as well. So it's 2.5% top 5 for the small test set and 0.21 for the large test set. So to put this in perspective, in MindEye, we have a kind of similar chance performance for the large test set. So I think that's kind of the better comparison to use. And so again, purely talking about retrieval here, we can find with fMRI that retrieval is above 90%, where chance performance is 0.3. Whereas here we're talking about top 5 accuracy being around 12%, where in their case, chance performance is 0.2%. So it's a similar chance level performance. And so you can kind of have this interpretable difference in going from like 90% to 10% is at least kind of how I was trying to interpret the differences in things. But still, it's fairly good, the fact that they can get 11, 12% when there are multiple examples of the same category in the test set. Another thing to note here is that they're using the CLS token, which is the pooled token that represents the class of the image that they're mapping to. And I think this is maybe making their performance worse. So for our experiments with MindEye, we map both to the CLS token and to the last hidden layer. So that includes the CLS token as well as all of the image patches, the image patch tokens. And retrieval is way better when you map to the last hidden layer rather than the pooled last layer classification token. And so I'm surprised that they're specifically mapping to the CLS here. And then they're also concluding like, we can't really decode the low level stuff, but they're only mapping to the high level class token, if that makes sense. So I think they could have improved their performance a lot by not confining themselves to just the last layer output of these models. And maybe that explains why VGG19 does better than Dino V2, at least in the small test set. Another thing to note is, they make a big deal about the temporal resolution of MEG, right? But their time window here is 0.5 seconds in the past to a second after. So it's 1.5 second time window, which is not really real time. Like if you want to make a big deal about decoding immediately, but here you still need to have the time window. And they do address this here. So they change the time window from negative half a second to a second into the future. And they change it to just 0 to 250 millisecond time window. And they get pretty comparable performance, I think. So large test set, their best performance for this smaller window is around 8%, whereas here they were getting maybe 12%. So the question of like, can you get this to work with only 250 milliseconds worth of data? It seems to be that, yeah, they're able to get fairly comparable, slightly worse, but still, comparable results using a very constrained time window. Something that I don't really understand is this data point here. Like, so the image is no longer visible after 0.5 seconds, but they're still able to decode to retrieve the original image to the same performance from the time window after offset. So somehow, and they bring this up, they say, interestingly, the recent self-supervised model DynoV2 performs particularly good after the image offset. And I don't know how, like, I don't know, it doesn't seem to make sense to me why it could do just as well using the time window after the image leaves compared to when the image is visible. I wish that they discussed that more. And it's also kind of interesting that DynoV2 specifically is the one that has the same level of performance for both.
Paul, it also seems weird to me that it would go down at 0.5. Like that is the 0.5 is the exact image offset, right?
Right.
I
Yeah,
couldn't
that's
believe
also,
it if it kind of stair stepped down from when the image is presented to the offset to a half second later, but that there's this dip is strange.
There might be like a recoil in brain activity after the image turns off, right? Like you might
yeah.
get the neurons that are, like the same way that we see an after image after we look at something and then like close our eyes, right? The neurons that you might, and that after image is like in complementary colors or whatever to what you were looking at before. Like you might get a kind of like flip around when the image turns off.
Yeah, that's a super interesting suggestion. I never even thought of something like that.
And then actually, yeah, I guess their model is handling all of the inputs in more or less the same way, regardless of the time points. Maybe if they had a more sophisticated approach of like how to handle the time points that have the image displayed versus offset, maybe then it's able to use the information from both better, potentially. Here are their results for retrieval. They block things off into like worst, average, and best. And the x-axis here is the time. So 0 would be stimulus onset. So they are showing at least a nice showcase of how well it does over time, which is nice. And then this is the reconstruction performance. So they copy the exact same model as Verslick and Van Rullen to get these values. And basically what they're saying is that to get these values. So what they're saying is that there's like no low level information in these MEG reconstructions, but there is pretty decent high level information. And they talk about this as, the MEG data maybe intrinsically doesn't have enough like signal for low level processing. I also think this could be an artifact of the modeling approach itself. So like, if you have a different approach towards getting low level reconstructions, maybe you would get better results. The way that they do it in Verslick and Van Rullen is they map to the AutoKL, the space of this VDVAE model, this pre-trained model. And the way that the VDVAE model works is that it does have like some high level information already in it, in these embeddings. So you're kind of working with this kind of odd space. You're trying to decode specifically the low level information, but the autoencoder embeddings already have this kind of prior for high level category information. So I'm not sure exactly how much interpretation to put into the complete lack of low level signal in the MEG. And I think I'm kind of wrapping up my comments here. Oh, I had a comment here about how their comparison is with ridge regression, right? And so my initial interpretation of this is they'll just do ridge regression for every participant going from the channel space of MEG directly to the embedding space of like the images. But it says here that they predict 1 of 16 different latent representations with ridge. So I guess they're doing classification. They're not just doing ridge regression to the clip embeddings of all the images. They're doing something regarding this 16-wise category level decoding. I didn't really understand this, but my hunch would be that if you restrain the model to only try and predict 1 of 16 latents, then that's going to do worse than a direct mapping to the embedding space, regardless of the original class of the images. So I don't know if that's like a fair comparison or not. But anyway, these are the results that they get for that, for the ridge regression comparison. So I guess to do a quick lookup here, Dino V2, they got 7.5 for the small data set, whereas they get around 12% for their more complicated model. So my kind of, I guess to finish up my kind of discussion of this paper, my kind of takeaways were that you can indeed do MEG reconstruction and retrieval, although it's going to be a lot worse than fMRI. It kind of brings into question, what is the use case of real time? If you do need to do immediate level reconstruction and retrieval for like communication with brain computer interfaces, then yeah, you're going to need a modality that can be available to be processed at the sub-second level. But if you care about real time for other use cases, like there's plenty of use cases for real time that don't need it to be near instantaneous outputs. You know, there's all sorts of neurofeedback studies, and you know, you can do reconstruction at the longer time scale and still have, you know, if the reconstruction results are so much better than MEG for fMRI, maybe that's more viable. I'm not sure, but you know, there's a lot of different directions you can go with real time aside from just instantaneous communication. And it also makes me think about things like multimodal models. So there's the things MEG data set, there's the things EEG data set, there's obviously the natural scenes data set that was used for fMRI. And the fact that we do this all with clip, or we do this all with clip loss to be more specific, makes it seem like you could do a multimodal contrastive model quite straightforwardly. So I would be curious about whether you could improve MEG reconstructions by tapping into the like pre-trained fMRI model, for instance, because everything gets aligned to the embedding space. It doesn't really matter what is the initial modality, as long as you have a way to map to that same shared space and do the contrastive loss. So not only are they approaching, you know, general across subject modeling with this kind of approach, but I bet you could extend it to working with more modalities as well. And yeah, so I think like multimodal applications seem really promising. So that's all my thoughts. Anyone have further comments? Yeah, Andrea.
May I add one point to your super interesting discussion? So one point was about the worst accuracy in the reconstruction of low-level feature as compared to the high-level feature, the table that you showed before. One possible reason for this different level of accuracy between these kind of features is that for the alignment training phase, they use basically all the sensor of the brain. Okay, and if you consider that, for example, if you simply consider that, for example, the visual processing is like is organized like in a hierarchy with early visual cortices that process the low-level feature, while, for example, some like higher region, like temporal or parietal, is processing something like a high-level feature. If you use all these features, if you use all the sensor, probably you are like overestimating the semantic high-level features compared to the early-level feature. And while if you use like a subset of the sensor, for example, the one located above the early visual cortices, maybe you could be able to extract or to align in a better way the brain response to this low-level feature instead of just the semantic level feature. And in this case, also the temporal processing of this kind of information is quite relevant, because of course you can expect that the low-level feature are early processed in the first 100 to 200 milliseconds, while the semantic feature are processed like in a late time window. So this could be also one possible way to try to improve the classification of the low-level feature in this kind of using this kind of modality, EG or MEG modality. So this could be really, quite interesting to explore.
Oh yeah, totally. That's an excellent comment. I think, yeah, like the potential with MEG is very unique in terms of the temporal resolution. So it seems obvious that one might want to explore the hierarchy of processing, right? Like if you can get to that millimeter level temporal resolution, and the fact that it takes, maybe it takes time for the full hierarchy of visual processing to complete, you can not only try and target maybe earlier visual regions, but you can also try and see how like the hierarchy of visual processing is completed. So yeah, I think there's like a lot of more exploration that could be done here. And we know, at least when we were testing for the mind-eye model, we tried doing whole brain, we tried doing like just the NSD general visual cortex kind of region, and using different areas of the brain for feeding into the model can produce really big differences in results. So if you care only about the low-level representation, it probably would be worthwhile to like specifically try to find just the areas of the brain that care solely about low-level information.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, thanks.
And that's, I'm not even aware of if people have tried that as well. But it seems like, yeah, if that's an obvious direction of like try to hone in on the specific regions of interest for the task. Because if you include more voxels that are high level, that's potentially tainting the signal, making it harder for the model to learn the mapping. Yeah, so I was kind of inspired to tap into the things data sets. There's actually like, I haven't tried working with things data sets, but they've got EEG, which is like really rapid sequence of images, either 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds. You've got obviously the things MEG. I would be really curious to try and like get all this together into a single model. And that's kind of the idea behind the things initiative in the first place, right? Collect a lot of data from different modalities, looking at similar images. And so it seems very obvious direction. Probably some other labs are trying it, but yeah, try and have like a multimodal decoding model, right? If EEG and MEG don't really work off the bat, maybe you can augment it by using like pre-trained weights for an fMRI model. Curious if anyone has thoughts about that. Does that seem feasible? Maybe we should like open that up as another project in the MEDAR group.
Yeah, I think this is kind of interesting thought. Yeah, I think but sometimes, but to be honest, we don't have any related EEG dataset and fMRI dataset at the same time, right? We cannot collect them.
Not simultaneously.
Yeah, I think so. And by the way, I just curious about one thing that you mentioned that they have do the same experiment on their frameworks, but on the SD dataset. But to be honest, fMRI data is not the same as MEG data. So how did they just transform it, or is they just map it into the MEG format? So I'm just a little bit curious about it.
Wait, you're saying how did they map the fMRI into MEG? Sorry.
Yeah, because you can see that if they trying to use the 270 multiple 180, so
Yeah, but they haven't. I don't think nobody has tried that,
yeah,
right?
really, but you can see that they have evaluation at the experiment part.
Oh, but that's a totally independent pipeline, just as like a reference point, you know?
Oh,
They
yeah,
didn't use
I
the
see.
MEG data at all for getting that row of results in their table.
Yeah, but the framework should be the same, right?
Yeah, I mean, the framework is the same aside from the inputs being of, the different dimensionality.
Ah, I see.
But yeah,
Okay.
like you can have like a different initial mapping to handle
Yeah.
different input dimensionalities. But you can make the initial mapping for the inputs, modality specific or like subject specific for a simple linear mapping. But then the whole rest of the model can be complicated and generalizable across the modalities. I think that's possible and hasn't been done yet.
Oh,
And also, I think that there's a lot of room for improvement on these MEG results, right? Like the fact that they only use the CLS token is one obvious problem that could have been addressed to make the results even better. The fact that they use convolutions, I think maybe was working against them because we tried doing convolutions with NSD and I don't think it worked that well. The fact that they that they have totally independent modules, right? Instead of a simultaneous retrieval reconstruction pipeline. I feel like there's a lot of room to improve the MEG results just based on this. So yeah, I think there's room to improve. And contrastive learning, I mean, this is like the perfect way to align different modalities. So yeah.
Oh yeah, and by the way, talk about say back to the following image for the plot. Yeah, for the tendency that it go decrease and after that it go increased after the image vanished. Yeah, for
Oh
this
yeah.
one. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I have thought a theory that it said that we sometimes, or maybe you usually don't remember recent events or recent things that had happened, but we do remember the things that have happened really before or very before. Is that possible for the same situations or the same mechanism that only happened in really short times, just like the recall things?
You're talking about like whether they offset it and then that disrupts your representation for it?
Yeah.
I guess it's possible. I mean, you're definitely going to be representing the blank image differently. But I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of surprised, to be honest, that there's such a difference.
Yeah, it should
I would have just thought, yeah, when the image is shown, you're going to get better decoding than when the image is not shown, right? But
yeah.
apparently that's not the case. But yeah, they don't really interpret it in this paper. So I mean, maybe that's like some deeper how we process images that are shown kind of mechanistic thing. I don't know.
I see. Thanks.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining this reading club. Hope people got something out of it. And oh, Andrea, if you're able to give us a hand pre-processing EEG, definitely send me a private message because I've never done EEG pre-processing before. So, and I know that can be kind of complicated. So if you have knowledge on that, that would be so appreciated.
Not super expert, but I would be really happy to glad because it's super interesting your approach. Thanks.
All right, yeah, thanks. Send me a message. We can chat after this. All right, thanks everybody, and take care. If you have any suggestions for how to improve this reading club, or if you have like suggestions for papers or presenting, send me a private message. And yeah, take care.
Thanks, Paul.